So I want to first off say welcome to everyone. I'm really glad to have you all here with us today. My name is Elizabeth McMuntatenko, and I'm a librarian here at UC Merced. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Michael Spivey, who's going to be giving our library faculty author series talk today. The Faculty Author Series showcases the latest research and scholarship by UC Merced faculty members, and we're really pleased that we've been able to continue it in this online format. If you'd like to be featured in a future Faculty Author Series talk, please let me know. And for today's talk, we're thrilled to have Dr. Michael Spivey be part of this series. Dr. Spivey is a faculty member at UC Merced in Cognitive and Information Sciences, and he holds a BA from UC Santa Cruz in addition to a master's and PhD from the University of Rochester. He's published 4 books, Who You Are, which came out in 2020, in addition to The Continuity of Mind, the Cambridge Handbook of Psycholinguistics, and Methods in Cognitive Linguistics. And he also received the William Proctor Prize for Scientific Achievement in 2010. We're really happy to have him with us today, and I'm going to turn this over now to Michael.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all for coming. I hope I can make this an enjoyable sort of précis or entree into the book, Who You Are. Let me share my screen and get to these slides. All right. There, I got all my windows where I need them. So in this talk, Who You Are, what I'm trying to do is give you a view of what the book tries to do. What the book does is goes sequentially chapter through chapter, providing experimental findings in a variety of areas that are going to try to encourage you to expand your definition of what you think you are, of what your mind is or what your consciousness is, what your experience is made of, the physical material that make up who you are. And it starts off in the book, the first couple chapters will focus on the frontal lobes of the brain and expand to the whole brain and recognize that the whole brain is who you are. It's not just decision-making centers in your frontal lobe. And then the next chapters expand to include your embodiment and how your body plays a role in some of your cognition, in your thinking. Your body does some of your thinking for you. And then you further expand to recognize findings showing that tools you hold in your hand actually do some of your thinking for you. They become part of who you are, part of your cognition. The way the tool reacts to your hands and the way your hands reacts to the tool, those physical objects that you work with every day become part of who you are, part of how your cognition is generated. And goes further even to later chapters where you start expanding to include not just inanimate objects that you work with, but other people in your environment, a wide variety of things in your environment become part of your thinking, part of your cognitive process, a sort of shared cognitive experience. And I'm hoping the experimental findings will convince you of this, to get you to expand that little Venn diagram that includes the physical material to make up who you are, to get quite wide and include a variety of things, that who you are is a whole lot more than just a brain or even just a brain and body. Where these findings are going to come from is cognitive science and its relationships to linguistics and psychology and neuroscience, philosophy, computer science, anthropology as well is in this. Political science shows up as part of this cognitive science network. And UC Merced is quite strong in cognitive science. And it's not just individual disciplines. It's not going to be a multidisciplinary approach that provides all these findings that are so important for the message I'm trying to put together. It's actually the connections between those disciplines, not just a multidisciplinary approach, but an interdisciplinary approach where you've got connections like a network across all these various disciplines, including anthropology and political science and others. And it's the connections that actually are doing a lot of the work sometimes, where multiple researchers from different disciplines get together and collaborate. Rather than the intelligence coming out of this discipline or that discipline, it comes out of the interaction among the disciplines. Some of the most compelling findings really do exactly that, a more cognitive science interdisciplinary approach. So here's that sequence of arguments that I mentioned initially that's going to walk us through findings in the literature, findings in cognitive science and neuroscience that will, I hope, encourage you to expand that definition of who you are. You're not just a brain. Your mental activity extends quite beyond your neural activity. So we'll start off with decisions emerging from the brain, apparently not from free will. This is work that started in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet. And he had participants sit in a laboratory and watch a little dot go around a clock. And that dot would go around and they just keep track, I guess from your perspective, they go around here to keep track of where that dot is. And you get to use your free will whenever you feel like it to just lift your finger. That's all you have to do in this experiment. There's no stimulus presented and you have to respond. It's just whenever you feel like it, lift your finger. And then wait a little while and you can do it again for another trial, but you get to be the initiation of the trial. You get to decide when to do it. You get to use your free will to decide, I'm going to lift my finger. And what Libet's doing at that time is recording not only at what time your finger lifts. He's got a little electromyograph. It's going to record the muscle activity in that finger. So it'll get an instantaneous measure of when the finger muscles contracted to lift. And so you'll have a millisecond timing for when that finger actually lifted, when the action took place. And then the participant is keeping track of this little dot as it goes around to know when they felt like they had the initiation of that idea, when free will came from them and they decided, I'm going to lift my finger now. And naturally, that sort of realization of when you've decided to do that is going to be associated with some point in this clock where the dot was. You just keep your eyes on it and decide, okay, I'm deciding now, and remember where the dot was. And you report that to the experimenter. So now Benjamin Libet has two little time slices, two time stamps for when the finger actually moved, and a couple hundred milliseconds before that when you were aware that you want to move your finger. And luckily it is beforehand. Your finger isn't moving before you want it to. It's a free will decision. But he's got a third timestamp as well. He's recording EEG from the scalp. So electrical fields from your neurons producing lots of activity. Those electrical fields actually spread out and they go right through your skull, and they can be detected by little surface electrodes that rest gently against your scalp. And they can pick up those changes in electrical activity. And so not just is he figuring out exactly the time of the action when the muscles of the finger contracted to lift, he's also keeping track of when the person reported their being aware of intending to lift their finger, which is about 200 milliseconds before the finger rises. He's also got this third measure of EEG activity on a few different regions of the brain, especially the frontal areas is where a lot of this evidence is found. You get a rising change in the voltage for the scalp EEG, showing a change in the electrical activity in frontal regions of the brain that's happening, a rise that's statistically greater than baseline, about 550 milliseconds before all of this stuff happens. So long before you're aware of making your decision to lift your finger, your brain's already changing its activity in preparation for lifting that finger. It's sort of like your brain is making this freely will decision and forming it before you're even aware of it. This created a firestorm of debate in philosophy and in neuroscience and in psychology. A lot of the cognitive and neurosciences came out to arm wrestle over these findings to try to either defend free will or show that maybe free will is not a valid concept. It certainly is an unusual concept to imagine that you've got some chain of cause and effect that when you trace it back, it gets to a point where it stops and you can't trace it further back because this was a freely will decision. We're used to thinking of cause and effect as having a chain that you could trace all the way back to as far as you can find it, as long as your measurements can get there. The notion that there would be something that doesn't have a previous cause, an effect that happened and had no preceding cause, that notion of free will is a scientifically complicated idea. So a lot of researchers were quite happy to see this finding that it looks like your brain is sort of gradually forming a pattern of activity across millions and millions of neurons in your frontal lobes to generate a plan to become aware of lifting your finger and then actually lifting your finger at these points in time. But the debate raged on for a while, and it's become a little stronger to defend this notion that the brain is doing this before you're aware of it, and not just a few hundred milliseconds before, which is part of what the methodological debates were about. With fMRI, John Dylan Haynes followed up those experiments more recently and is able to get a much more fine-grained spatial resolution of what parts of the brain are active. It's not going to be as fine-grained temporal resolution. EEG is going to give you millisecond by millisecond temporal resolution, but it's going to look at whole coarse regions of the brain. And fMRI can look at very specific regions of the brain and has to average over about a whole second. So the clock that Dylan Haynes used here is more coarse in its time, its temporal scale. Every 500 milliseconds, so every half second, a new letter shows up on the screen that this participant is looking at while they're in the fMRI scanner. And they just have to keep track of what letter was on the screen when they had their freely will decision to have an action. And it's not just lifting a finger. In this case, it's pressing a button, either the left or the right button, in a little controller that they hold in their hand. So they're lying in that fMRI machine. They got some mirrors that let them see a video display that looks like this little letter clock that shows a new letter every half second. And you just keep track of what letter was on the screen when you had your freely will decision to press either the left or the right button. And you could pick whichever one you want. So it's a freely will decision where the free will is for the timing and for the choice of which button to press. With higher spatial resolution, they're able to get essentially more information about subtle, tiny little regions of, in this case, left frontal lobe, the lateral frontopolar cortex and the medial frontopolar cortex in the left hemisphere, right up in here. Those regions carried information in their patterns of activation that could tell the experimenter as much as 8 seconds before the button got pressed, could tell the experimenter with 60% accuracy which button is going to get pressed. So wrap your head around this. 8 seconds before you've pressed a button left or right, and about 7 seconds or so before you even realized you were planning to press a button left or right, you haven't even decided. 7 seconds before you've thought you're going to press a button and you figured out which one you're going to press, your brain's already producing patterns of activity in those frontal regions that can be decoded as a pretty good indication, 60% accuracy with 50% being chance, a pretty good indication of which button you're actually going to press. So your brain knows what you're going to do several seconds before you know what you're going to do. And if you have someone who's reading your brain activity, they can actually predict what you're going to do with some impressive degree of improvement on chance performance 7 seconds before you know it. So one aspect of this finding is to really struggle over what it would mean to not have free will. It does look like your sense of free will is not the actual source of free will, but your brain is generating a decision in that pattern of activity that bubbles up over the course of several seconds. That's going to provide information in that pattern of neural activity across millions of neurons. And there's information in there that's bubbling to the top to turn into a decision. So your free will might be owned by your brain, but it's not necessarily owned by your conscious awareness. Your conscious awareness comes in a few seconds later and says, oh, I think I know what we're doing, and pretends to own what's happening when in fact, your brain was what's responsible. So the findings like this, I think, help encourage people to think of those frontal lobes as a decision center for the brain. And for a lot of people, it feels like that frontal lobe region is where the thinking is happening, where you are, where your mind is, where your cognitive activity is. It's not some individual neuron. A playful term is a grandmother cell. It's not some single individual neuron that all by itself makes a decision for you, the way you might imagine you'd have a single neuron that codes for recognizing one person's face, like your grandmother. 50 years ago, there were some musings about that kind of way of coding in the brain. It's not individual localist neurons that are making a decision for you or recognizing grandma's face for you. It's a pattern of activity across many neurons, millions and millions of neurons, and not just in prefrontal cortex. When you look at the neuroanatomy of the brain, those millions of neurons that are all working together to have some stable pattern of activation to bubble together to finally have you press the left button or the right button, whichever you get to choose. That pattern of activity in frontal lobes is going to be connected to neighboring regions of sensory motor cortex, premotor cortex, the hippocampus, and language areas of the brain, and vision areas of the brain. And all these brain regions are richly connected to one another. So pretending that the activity in that decision center of the frontal lobes is somehow the module in which your thinking happens and where your decisions take place. And maybe all the rest of this motor cortex and visual cortex and auditory cortex, those are just sort of the circuit board for your robot body that you're inside of. And your mind is this little frontal lobe, and the rest is just following like a machine that follows the instructions that the frontal lobe gives it. Excuse me. The evidence is showing that that's just not an accurate way to describe things. In part, simply the neuroanatomy is a good hint as to that. These connections, these little arrows I'm drawing, show sort of ways to think about how when signals are being sent from frontal cortex to motor cortex to have you lift a finger or press a button, when you look at those fibers in the neuroanatomy, they're bidirectional pretty much always. Any place, any pair of brain regions that are connected to in one way are connected bidirectionally. And so there's going to be a feedback loop there almost unavoidably. That it's not just frontal cortex telling motor cortex what to do. Sometimes motor cortex is telling frontal cortex what to do, and they work together to come up with a shared decision about which button I'm going to press. And this happens with sensory cortices as well. And so the neuroanatomy and a great deal of multisensory perception research really convinces us that rather than thinking of that frontal lobe as one little Venn diagram inside which is the you, the sense of consciousness, and the rest is just a circuit board for your robot body, is probably a wrong way to think about it. You should expand that Venn diagram to include not just the frontal lobes, but the whole brain. And maybe that shouldn't be surprising. If you know a little bit about neuroscience, you might think, of course, the brain is the engine that makes me who I am, not just one little piece of the brain. And I'm going to move a little further now with some findings that show up in some of those early chapters, but not the first necessarily chapter. Oops, too far. We're going to talk about perception relying on the environment as its memory. When you look at visual perception, especially, Kevin O'Regan pointed out years ago that the eyeballs are actually very inaccurate organs. They're impressive globes, but they're not perfect spheres. They don't maintain a perfect rendition of where the light enters the eyes and makes what gets called a retinal image, a pattern of light input on the retina in the back. There's a lot of irregularities in that system. And then when you look at later stages of how it sends neural signals to cortex, visual cortex in the back of the brain, those various relay stations perform a fair number of modifications to the actual signal, filling in the blanks and making alterations to the actual light pattern input. So this imperfect organ of the eyeball and imperfect signal transmission is confusing for researchers when you then look at your own visual experience and sort of intuitively, you feel like, I see things the way they really are. You look around your environment and you can see maybe a coffee cup and maybe some chairs and pictures on a wall or something. And you feel like I see those things as they really are. And most of the time you do. In the 1980s, people suggested, cognitive psychologists especially, imagined that since the very center of the retina has the best resolution, and then the rest of your retina that gets a peripheral vision has really poor resolution, you don't have good image processing going on in the periphery, you tend to point your foveas, point your eyes at particular locations, and eye movements tend to happen about 3 or 4 times a second. So you point this high resolution sensor portion of the center of your retina here, and then over here, and over here, and that's how you collect these little high resolution snapshots of that part of the scene, and that part of the scene, and some other part of the scene. And these cognitive psychologists suggested that maybe the way you feel like you have a full spatially constant view of this real 3D immersion, instead of a collection of snapshots that you collected over time, which is what your eyes are really doing, that maybe you stitch together in memory the previous snapshot and the current snapshot and the snapshot from a couple eye movements ago, and you sort of put them together like a puzzle in your mind. And so you have this internal representation of that rich 3D world, and that's why you perceive it as a rich 3D world, even though your sensors are really sampling it in a very limited way. Well, they did a handful of experiments in the 80s to try to find evidence for that internal representation that's fully rendered and all stitched together perfectly, and found out that it doesn't work, that you don't actually do that. And Kevin O'Regan suggested maybe you don't need to, in part because that full 3D rendering is already out there in the world. You don't need to make a copy, a complete, perfect copy of it inside your mind in some internal representation, because it's usually always accessible. Things don't vanish around you. If you're trying to remember what color someone's shirt is over in your peripheral vision, all it takes is 250 milliseconds, a quarter of a second, to move your eyes over there, collect that perceptually, and it happens so fast that you probably feel like you always knew what color that person's shirt was, because you were able to access it so immediately from your environment, not necessarily from an internal representation. Let's see. Now let me skip ahead. So what this suggests is that if you don't have a full internal representation of what that visual scene looks like, then you might not be able to detect changes that happen in the actual real world, because you wouldn't have a full 3D internal representation to compare those changes to and detect those changes. That you should be blind to changes in your visual scene. And so the whole field of change blindness exploded in the late 90s and early 2000s of people running interesting experiments in various laboratories and even outside on the sidewalk to show that people are often very unaware of important changes in the visual scene. And here's one that maybe a couple of you have seen this one before. I apologize, but I'm going to change this image to what looks like a copy of pretty much the same image, but there has been an important change in the scene. Some of you may have noticed it. Don't write it in the chat or don't tell your friend what that change is, but most of you probably haven't seen the change yet. I'm going to go back to the first version of this photo, and you're going to say, a lot of you, it looks like the same photo. I don't know what you're talking about. What changed? And once you do notice it, it'll be shocking. You're like, well, how did I not notice that on the first few times that Spivey switched back and forth to these two images? This change blindness experiment is a proof that you don't really have a full 3D internal representation that has every detail in mind, even though you kind of feel like it. And sometimes people have proposed that that's part of how you have a perceptual experience of feeling like you see everything around you. If you could really see everything around you, then this change I'm making between these two images would be instantly detectable. I'll tell you where it is now. It's the engine here, right under the wing, a pretty important part of the scene that if you were one of the soldiers here getting on this plane and it was missing that engine, you might want to change your plans. So it's a hugely important part of that scene, even though we tend to not notice these changes. And there's change blindness experiments that happen even in real life interactions on the street, where people change one person to another person asking questions on a map. And about half the time, people don't even notice that the person they were talking to 10 seconds ago has changed to another person, because it's someone they don't know and they haven't encoded all the fine-grained details of them. And so you make that change and they just go with the flow and continue helping this person find their way on a map, even though it's a different person. So change blindness experiments were powerful demonstrations that we don't have at least fully rendered 3D interpretation of the scene stored inside as an internal representation in your brain. Instead, you tend to let the environment be your external memory. It's performing part of your visual memory for you, that environment. It's performing some of your visual experience for you, and giving you a sense of everything is out there in the world and I'm aware of it all because I can access it by moving my eyes so quickly that it feels like I knew everything all along. I knew what color that person's shirt was, even though it wasn't stored in the mind. All right, so we've got this brain we've been playing with, and we have evidence now to expand, to include not just neural activity going on inside that brain as part of who the mind is, but the body that has effectors, limbs that can grab objects, and sensors that are mobile with moving your eyes around. And that interaction with the environment is one way to describe the information processing that generates your sense of consciousness. Not something purely neural, but a neural engine that's crucial for the whole process. And that neural engine is so tightly linked to your sensors and effectors interacting with the world that the flow of information in this now real person, not a little line diagram, a real person that has a brain in that skull and sensors on that body, and a body that's interacting with an environment. Tools that you can hold in your hand, tools that are pretty important, tools that make changes to the world and some of those changes that those tools make are part of the cognitive processing. When you're taking notes on paper or scribbling something down, or even just doodling, some of your neurocognitive activity is flowing out onto some artifacts out in the world. Ink is getting put on paper. And that winds up, you're watching what you're writing, that winds up being a feedback loop that alters some of the way you're thinking. Some of the actions out in the world are playing a role in changing your thinking, and some of your thinking is playing a role in changing the actions out in the world. That feedback loop makes it, encourages one to consider that the information processing from which your sense of consciousness or your sense of cognitive processing is emerging is something that's not just inside the brain. It's in this feedback loop between your brain, body, and the environment. And this particular tool in that man's hands is a very powerful tool for changing all kinds of things, changing the rules that millions of people follow. Let's look at tools and how they affect your cognition, how they become part of your body schema. This is a neuroscience research study showing that there are cells in the intraparietal cortex of your brain and in this monkey's brain here that respond to not just visual inputs, but also touch inputs. So somatosensory touch inputs on that hand will make that cell fire. So they got an electrode in there that's nestled right next to that neuron, and it records the activity of that neuron. And that neuron produces a lot of electrical activity, many spikes over time when you touch that monkey's right hand with anything. But it also, that same neuron will be really active when you show like a laser pointer near that monkey's hand. So there's no touching happening, but there's something visual. The monkey's looking down and sees some visual input happening near his hand, and that same neuron responds. So it's a multisensory neuron that responds to visual and touch input. And then you train that monkey on a tool, on using a tool. You put a grape near that hand instead of a laser pointer, and that grape, monkeys love the grapes, put a grape near the hand, that neuron goes nuts. The monkey grabs the grape, pops in its mouth, and it's a happy monkey. It's a happy neuron going crazy about, hey, I got a visual stimulus that soon became also a tactile stimulus, and now it's delicious. The receptive field visually for that neuron is right around the hand, just maybe an inch or two beyond the hand to pick up visual inputs of some interesting stimulus nearby the hand. And then you train that monkey with a little rake tool that allows it to drag a grape that's a whole 2 feet away to get near its hand and then pick it up and pop it in its mouth, and happy monkey again. After you train that monkey to use that tool, you can put the tool in the monkey's hand, and the monkey's allowed to drag the grape, but before the monkey does any motor action, you put a grape way out here. Now, before the training, that grape would have been outside of the receptive field for that neuron. That neuron would not be active for a grape that's way out here. It's outside sort of the viewing field of that neuron's inputs. But now, after training with this tool, that very same neuron will go crazy. It's producing lots of spikes, lots of electrical activity when you put a grape 2 feet away from the hand, near that tool, because that tool essentially has become part of that animal's body schema. It has a sense that things that are reachable, and that's what this neuron is coding for, things that are touching the hand and reachable nearby. Now things are reachable 2 feet away from that hand because the monkey's been trained to use this tool, and that neuron is coding for the reachability of those grapes and other stimuli. And that reachability now has been expanded thanks to the monkey's training with a tool. This inanimate object is now sort of treated as part of the body, part of how this animal determines its affordances in the environment. Things it can act on in the environment are now expanded to a wider range, and the neuron is coding for that. The neuron is treating this inanimate object as part of the body in a sense. So that important tool in this person's hand is part of that person's cognition. It's doing some of the thinking for them. Different things happen when that tool is in the hand than when the tool is not in the hand. I'm going to expand this further to look at sort of cognitive processes that are a little more complex than just grabbing a grape and popping it in your mouth. Work by our own Paul Maglio in the School of Engineering here years ago with David Kirsch looked at Tetris. And in the game of Tetris, you're supposed to rotate these shapes and land them down into these slots. And if you get a nice solid row of all filled in, then that row disappears. And so your stack doesn't pile up too much and end the game for you when it gets to the top. Maglio and David Kirsch looked at experts in this game and novices in this game. And the experts, a cognitive psychologist might predict, those experts have really fast internal representations of coming up with that shape or this shape and mentally rotating it in their mind. There's a whole field of research looking at mental rotation of an internal representation. And so you might have thought that that's what these experts are really good at. They can see that shape, have an internal representation, do its mental rotations to figure out what's the right orientation to slot it down there. And that's what makes them experts, is that they're really fast at that. But in fact, what they found, rather than this kind of traditional cognitive psychology approach to coming up with a working memory with generated rotation and test it mentally and generate another rotation, rather, the experts weren't just fast at mental rotation, they were fast at physical rotation when you press the button to do the rotation of that object. The experts who at Tetris were letting the world perform that cognitive operation of rotate, 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 instead of making their brain do it. So rather than relying on an internal representation, they were relying on the world to do some of their cognition for them, to do that rotation, the actual rotation of the object. And they just rotate, 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 and do quick little perceptual matching, which is a lot faster than an internal representation having to do its rotations. So those experts were essentially offloading a part of their cognition onto the environment and having their performance of this task take place not just neurally, but also physically and externally. And that's what made them experts at Tetris. A similar study by a student of mine, Elizabeth Grant, looked at a very old experiment by Carl Duncker called the radiation problem, where you've got, I'll read it for you, given a human being with an inoperable stomach tumor and lasers, rather than lasers, we can do talk about gamma rays. Gamma rays which destroy organic tissue at sufficient intensity. How can one cure the person with these gamma rays and at the same time avoid harming the healthy tissue that surrounds the tumor? Gamma rays is what they actually use nowadays for this kind of treatment. And we gave students a display like this so the participants could see a little diagram of what the external skin looks like and what the tumor looks like, and some labels for the tumor in the skin and healthy tissue. And they were supposed to try to figure out this problem of how do you how do you use gamma rays to destroy this tumor? And the tricky insight is that you combine them, you converge multiple weak gamma rays or lasers such that they're mild enough in each incident ray that it doesn't damage the skin, because you have mild ones, but when they converge, you'll have enough radiation and heat to actually destroy the tumor, which is a lot like what current gamma ray treatment uses for getting rid of tumors. And this is a tricky solution that for students to come up with. Only about a third of participants will come up with this insight of converging mild rays. And the other 2/3 will spend a full 10 minutes reaching an impasse and saying, well, I asked if I could do a tiny little incision in the skin here and aim that gamma ray through there. You told me I couldn't because that would damage the skin. And I came up with some other crazy idea that you told me didn't work. And now I'm stuck. And they'll sit there quietly for minutes in the experiment, not coming up with new solutions. And those 2/3 of the people will wind up not getting the right answer. What Betsy Grant did was to record their eye movements, and especially right before 30 seconds before the 1/3 of participants that have that aha moment. It's called an aha moment when they go, aha, I can converge these lasers to having come from different directions. That convergence insight in this context is often called an aha moment. That's the technical term in the literature, because people really do often go, aha, at least in English. And so you've got that moment for a third of your participants who did come up with a solution. They were successful. And during those last 30 seconds before that aha moment, where their eyes are going tends to be twice as much of the time they're looking at this surrounding skin compared to the people who are about to run out of their 10 minutes and give up. So there's some important difference here about people looking at that skin. When Betsy Grant looked at this in more detail, she found that basically what people were doing when they were on the brink of finding the solution, they hadn't reached the aha moment yet, but over those 30 seconds right preceding that moment, their eyes tended to look outside of the display, onto the skin, onto the tumor, and then the eyes would move again to another region on the skin and then to the outside. Almost like their scan path of their eye movements was painting multiple incident rays. And then boom, they found the solution and said, aha. So then Betsy followed it up with an experiment that uses an animated skin. You're going to have the environment do a little bit of your insight for you. And so with the animated skin, it's just blinked, drawing your eye movements a little bit. And so people are looking at this ever so slightly animated display, a pretty simple augmentation of your display, but it draws your eye movements to that blinking portion. She compared that with another condition with the tumor blinking, so that draws your eye movements to the center and may not be useful for insight to have you sort of generate these incident rays with your eye movements. And a static version to repeat that experiment. So in the first experiment, about a third of the people solved it. In the second experiment, we're manipulating the display with the static version, only a third of the people solved it. With the animated tumor, people's eyes are maybe being drawn toward the center, still only a third of the people solved it. But when that surrounding skin was blinking, 2/3 of the people found that solution. They had that aha moment. So this conceptual insight on, I need to think about convergence, this concept of convergence, that concept was inspired by a simple little augmentation of the perceptual aspects of the display to draw your eye movements, to make you look around this display in a way differently than you otherwise would have. And the way you looked around on this display helped you generate a pretty deep and difficult insight to solve a tricky problem. All right. Let's see. I'm going to skip this one because I want to get to the next part, and I'm getting a little low on time. So if people want to ask me about moral decisions in the question and answer period, I can go back to that stuff. But I want to show you some findings from work where people have looked at not only is it external objects and maybe animated displays and smart tutorials or whatever that can do some of your thinking for you, where you can offload your cognition out in the world, but there's also not just inanimate objects out in the world, there's other people out in the world. And sometimes those other people, kind of like the inanimate objects, are able to do some of your thinking for you. They become part of your cognitive process. One example of that comes from a study by two of my grad students, Daniel Richardson and Rick Dale. Rick Dale was faculty here at UC Merced for a few years, a little while ago. He's now at UCLA. And what Richardson and Dale did was to track people's eye movements while they looked at a display of 6 faces. And what they started with was one person who puts on headphones and a mic, and they look at this display and her eye movements are recorded while she just tells a random story about her favorite episode of Friends TV show. They also did it with The Simpsons. They had 6 Simpsons faces as well. And so this person's just telling an unscripted story about their favorite episode, and that's all gets recorded, and you record her eye movements as well. And then you play back for participants who come into the lab that audio story over their headphones. They don't get to see the eye movement record of what the speaker was looking at, but that listener's eye movements are being recorded. I'll go ahead and you'll be able to see the crosshairs show here the speaker's eye movements while she's talking. And then there's a little square dot that is the listener's eye movements, or one of the listener's eye movements.
So Monica and Chandler are sister and brother. Monica and Ross are sister and brother. Never mind.
And so you may have noticed that that little square dot is following some of the same places where the crosshairs are going, because the listener is just hearing speech from this person and watching the same display, and they tend to be looking at the same faces at around the same time.
So Monica and Chandler are sisters.
And so when you look at the time series of that speaker looking at this face and that face and another face, and the time series of the listener looking at this face and that face and another face, you'll find that some of the time they're looking at the same face at exactly the same time. But most of the time, that listener is looking at the same face that the speaker was looking at about a second ago. Essentially, the speaker looks at that face and then says the name of that person or says some reference to that person. And the listener hears the reference to that person and moves their eyes to that face. There's your 1.5 seconds or so of delay, where this peak of eye movements doing the same thing happens with about 1.5 seconds delay. They're looking at the same things, not at exactly the same time, but close to it. So one little part of their bodies is getting coordinated and getting correlated such that your eye movements are doing some of the same things that the speaker's eye movements were doing. This also happens for brain activity. So Anna Kulin, who's going to be an MTS speaker next Monday, did research at our Mind, Technology, and Society speaker series. She'll be over Zoom. Anna Coolin did work almost a decade ago, looking at not correlation among eye movements, but correlation among brain activity. And so she had one speaker tell an unscripted story while her EEG was being recorded, and another speaker tell his unscripted story while his EEG is being recorded. Then she made a conjoined stimulus of two ghostly faces overlaid, the male and the female, and the two voices being heard, male and female, and have different participants watch that identical stimulus, that little video clip, but they're told to either attend to the female speaker, and you can kind of tune out the male's voice while you do that, or this person might attend to the male speaker and tune out the female's voice. And what she found was that the electrical activity on the EEG from the person who's listening to the female was more correlated with the electrical activity of that female's brain over time while she was telling the story days ago. But this activity is correlated with that activity and not so much with that activity. Even though it's the same visual stimulus these two people are getting, the same auditory stimulus, being able to attend to one and having sort of a conceptual understanding of that person's story and tuning out the other one made the listener's brain do some of the same activity that the speaker's brain was doing at multiple time scales, at the time scale of a few seconds for sort of semantic units within a sentence, and even high correlations on the time scale of tens of seconds. So saying a sentence or two and having a mental activity that produces electrical activity. The speaker produces some activity and then produces a sentence or two, and then that listener hears that and produces some mental activity similar to the speaker's mental activity. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because I'm close to running out of time. There's also postural sway. People's postural sway gets coordinated. When they're talking to each other, there'll be little movements of the head, movements of the spine that make your postural sway get correlated. People in a conversation have a number of ways in which they get correlated, not just their brains and their eyes, but their whole bodies. All right. So let's get back to this guy that we're trying to talk about. The real world was real people, and he's a real person. He's got activity in his brain that's generating some cognition. He's got sensors and effectors on his head and on his body, and some of those activities of the body are doing some of his thinking for him. And there's tools out in the world he's interacting with that are doing some of his thinking for him. And there's other people out in the world that are doing some of his thinking for him. That shared cognitive experience is not just producing coordinations in their gestures. When people talk to each other, they're often, you'll see people rub their face, and then a couple seconds later, the other person will wind up touching their face somehow. And when people cross their legs in a meeting, sometimes someone else will just absentmindedly cross their legs also. These motor coordinations happen naturally, and it's because neural correlations are happening naturally. When you get on the same wavelength with someone in a conversation, it's not just a cute metaphor, it's an actual wavelength of your brain activity, that there's correlations among yours and theirs. And important things happen in our, not just in our immediate interactions, but in our cultural context. As you look at a broader spatial scale of a wider environment that's doing some of your cognition for you and carrying out some of the information processing that makes your mind happen. You expand that spatial scale to a wider range. You're also going to expand it to a wider temporal scale where entire things change over entire cultures for years. So I'm going to get a little bit philosophical with just a couple minutes of ending this to point out that this kind of philosophical externalism that I'm promoting here is what it's called. Externalism is a way of referring to mental activity being not just internal to the skull, but mental activity is so reliant on that feedback loop of the environment that sometimes your mental activity really is well described as happening in here and out here as well, as you're working with a tool that you know how to use really well, working with a person that you know how to cooperate with really well. There's a long history of philosophical externalism and ecological psychology that has made some of these same kinds of points. The action perception cycle is what I'll touch on here as one example that Ulrich Neisser, the father of cognitive psychology, really, he wrote the book on it in 1967. And then he wrote another book in 1976 that kind of backed away from that traditional information processing approach and suggested that rather than thinking of cognition as something that takes perceptual inputs, performs computations on them via the brain, and then produces action outputs, that reflex arc approach, as others have referred to it, is only half the story. There's a feedback loop here. Your actions aren't just responses to your perceptual inputs and your cognitive computations. Your actions are responsible often for your next perceptual input. And so a lot of times your actions are essentially performing cognitive operations out in the world, like pressing that rotation button. If you're an expert Tetris player, you're performing that rotation of that image, not internally, but externally, but it performs the same cognitive operation of rotating the object. So you can see if it's going to match well when you place it in that game. This feedback loop, or this action perception cycle, is something that changes the way psychologists and cognitive scientists think about how the mind works, that it's not just a stimulus followed by a response. Sometimes that response is directly responsible for the next stimulus. And now your computations are happening in this feedback loop that is going to be hard to find the precise carvings up of where to say this thing was a stimulus or was it a response. You try to draw some Venn diagrams around some memory part of the brain or a language part of the brain or a visual part of the brain, and you find that those interactions between those brain regions are so rich that you probably should expand your definition to include the whole brain. And then you see how the brain interacts with the body, and those interactions are so fast and so quick and interactive. They look a lot like the way those brain areas are interacting, that interaction between the brain and body. And so maybe you should expand to include the body as part of your mental activity. And then the same thing goes for expanding to include the environment. In the continuity of mind, I wrote several years ago, one way I described it was, if this is your brain contents as a Venn diagram, you might surround it by your body contents. And your mental activity might be well described as a kind of Gaussian distribution or a bell curve shape that includes the truth value of the brain content being part of your mental activity is huge. It's 1.0. Stuff going on inside your brain is definitely part of your mental content, definitely part of who you are. But also stuff that's outside of your brain, but inside your body, it's still going to be partly part of your mental activity. It's part of who you are. The way your body is moving is doing some of your cognition for you to maybe 0.8 true. And even things that are outside your body are doing a little bit of your thinking for you. Then when you get interacting with someone else, maybe you're sharing a map that you're both pointing at, and that object is external to both of you, but it's performing some computations of cognition for both of you. And so it's making you have a slightly shared mind because that map is part of your cognition and part of their cognition. Or maybe your bodies are touching and you're holding hands and having a deep conversation about something. And your minds are really sharing a lot of mental activity overlaying one another. You add time to this, and you're going to see a whole manifold of mental activity, of cognition, of your consciousness even, of who you are, isn't just inside a brain or inside a body. If that body's moving to the left and the other body's moving to the right, that cognition is an overlay of a manifold of shared experience and shared information processing that makes those two brains a little bit like one mind for a little while if they're holding hands and having that deep conversation. And then the conversation's over and they go back to their jobs and doing some other stuff. And maybe they have another conversation with someone else, an experience that makes them for a little while, a little bit like one mind, one system that is so interlinked with its eye movements that are coordinated, brain activity that's correlated, postural sway that's correlated. They wind up becoming a little bit like one system or one mind. And that's the intersection of minds. And that's what who you are is all about. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm seeing some clapping in the participants, which I think is well deserved. And we do have a few minutes for questions. So if anybody wants to raise their hand with a question, or if you'd like to type them into the chat and I can read them, that is great too. But I'll stop talking for a second so people can kind of formulate their thoughts. And actually, while we're waiting, I have some questions too. I was just thinking about your last point, and I was wondering if there's an intersection of cognitive activity in online environments, so like on Zoom or like social media or email. Does it expand out that far, or is that not? I don't know if that's been studied at all.
very recently, it's been studied in Chris Kello's lab, in fact. So our own Chris Kello in the Cognitive and Information Sciences Department, he's also Dean of Grad Division right now. So Chris's lab has been looking at how people get coordinated, not just making the same kind of eye movements at near the same time, but looking at sort of the signature of the noise in their activity. So when I'm producing speech to you, you can do an analysis of those waveforms of speech and find a fair bit of variance, a noise factor in there. And that noise, when you plot it on log coordinates over time, is going to have a power law. And most things that have some kind of complex temporal structure will have what's called a power law. You plot it on log coordinates, it makes a pretty straight line. And one person's speech or one person's manual activity, their gestures and stuff, you can record that with a camera and see what kind of changes they're making with their body while they're talking. You're going to have some particular slope of that power law for your speech over time or your gestures over time. And people will get what Chris has called complexity matching. So if I've got one particular slope for my structure, the signature of my variation over time in my speech or in my gestures, and we're having a conversation and you've got another slope of your own, our two slopes over time, as we get on the same page in this conversation, will start to match each other and we'll have the same kind of signature of variation in our behaviors, both in our speech and in our gestures. We'll get on the same page, even not just in the time signature itself, but in the statistical signature of what kinds of variance and noise-like properties you have in your change over time, both for gestures and for speech when we're having a live, real in-person conversation. And then Camila Alvarez had a dissertation just this year showing that you can do this over Zoom as well, and you record that kind of stuff. And you get the same complexity matching of people producing similar slopes in their sort of noise signature over their speech. So they wind up getting coordinated in their speech timing and pattern, but their gestures don't get correlated when they're over Zoom. And one possible reason for that is because most people use Zoom with a relatively zoomed in face, and you just get a talking head and you have a nice conversation, you get on the same page in the way you're speaking, but your gestures often are not on camera, are not in frame. And so that bodily coordination that happens in live conversations that a lot of us don't even notice winds up being a big part of, I think, how you become coordinated and on the same page, how it is you feel like you've had a better conversation when you hung out with someone in person than you did when you hung out with someone over Zoom. And one solution for this is just maybe we should all try our best to zoom out a little bit. And when you're on Zoom, maybe have the frame be far enough away that more of your gestures will show up. And so when you're doing your gestures, the other person will see them and you'll see theirs. And then that might help you get a little more coordinated. But it's certainly a powerful demonstration of exactly why it is that even though we can do lots of good interactions over Zoom, it doesn't feel as good, as warm and connected as a real in-person visit.
That's super interesting. Thank you. So we do have some time for some more questions too. So I definitely like to invite people to chat those, raise your hand, just unmute yourself and ask. That's also fine. And I'm not seeing anything come up.
In the chat window, Emily.
Oh, there's one.
Is asking, how does your understanding of how the mind works actually shape how you personally move through the world? Perhaps what you surround yourself with. For example, people today are interested in training or retraining how they think. What are some habits or approaches you may have applied in your life? That's an excellent question, Emily. And the lesson from this externalism, this philosophical externalism, to me is place yourself in good environments. So I had to sort of skip over for time the moral decision-making experiments, but we've got some experiments showing that you can actually tweak a person's moral choice about something like, is murder ever justifiable? And they might have a choice of saying it's sometimes justifiable or never justifiable. And you track their eyes and you can sort of, if they're uncertain or trying to decide between one of these, and you can see their eye movements are going back and forth, if the computer wants you to pick one of those options, it can wait for you to be landing on one of those options and prompt you to respond now. And we can actually nudge people's moral decisions about these quandaries about 5% or so, a statistically significant amount, to get them to give a response that they might not have given if the computer hadn't interrupted them right when they happen to be looking at one of those options. So this means that your environment is doing some of your, not just trivial decisions, but some of your important decisions for you. And so, my way that I've personally changed the way I move through the world is to make sure that I put myself in good environments where I will make good decisions and not be tricked by, subtle accidental scenarios where some little option that I might normally be opposed to, I wind up doing anyway. Your environment is doing some of your thinking for you. Choose your friends carefully, choose your environments carefully, because that's part of who you are.
Looks like we have a hand that's raised. I'm just trying to find the person on my Zoom.
Donald, hi. So, Michael, what you're saying there is kind of scary about computers nudging. Has this gotten into the commercial world? Is Amazon and Facebook, are they manipulating us that way? Are politicians manipulating us that way using this cognitive science?
Well, so I don't think that's going to happen with eye movements yet anyway, because your standard camera on your laptop or your computer isn't going to be tracking your eye movements yet. But there's definitely more overt ways that people have tricked you into making decisions, not necessarily you particularly, but all of us. And it's certainly when you look at political election tactics, they're doing sort of conceptual tricks to get you to be opposed to some candidate or in favor of some candidate that is not based on the truth.
Yeah.
And especially recently, really bold lies have been extremely prevalent. But these subtle kind of perceptual tricks are things that are subtle enough that they wouldn't actually be that attractive to real companies that want to manipulate your choices for this product or that product or whatever. It's a 5% nudge. So for me, the lesson is not, oh my goodness, we're in trouble, the robots are coming and they're going to make our decisions for us. But it's a demonstration that something that you use to define yourself, your moral choices. I do believe that murder is never justifiable, or maybe I do believe that murder is sometimes justifiable. The moment in which I come up with a situation where I have to respond with taking one of those stances, the immediate effects in the environment can actually nudge me. And it's happening all the time, and it's usually accidental. And so you could choose those environments in advance carefully and reduce the number of accidental nudges that push you in a direction you didn't intend to go. But it's like subliminal priming too, was something that people got excited about. Was brief flashes on a screen for a commercial or in a movie. And people were worried that advertisers were going to manipulate people with those subliminal influences. And the priming effects are very subtle in that. And so you can prime someone to choose one option or choose another one, but they're very, very small effects. And just simply overt advertising that's following legal restrictions is way more effective than those cute little nudges. But everything counts, every subtle thing will give you a 5% nudge this way or that way, and have you maybe make a moral stance that you didn't think you would make.
Yeah, I think about, back in, when was it, 96 or whatever, the famous O.J. Simpson Newsweek and Time cover where I think it was Time magazine made his skin a lot darker in the photo. They darkened the photo.
Yeah.
And
that's a good
we're talking about something that's much more subtle than that and harder to pick out. I mean, people immediately got onto, hey, they messed with this photo.
Yep. That certainly happens, no doubt. And it's good that we can identify it sometimes and call it out.
Thank you so much. Again, I am noticing that I think we're just about at time, but thank you. And I'm seeing lots of thank yous in the chat, which is great too, and some applause. And so thank you for being part of this series, and thank you to everyone for attending this afternoon. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. This was fun.